photography is also connected with eyesight and looking. It may be computational as well, but it depends on whether you have what Jeff Wall calls an affection for the appearance of things. If you're actually interested in the way the world looks and the way the world looks to a lens and a camera of any kind, that directness of photography, I'm not saying it's authentic or anything like that, and it might still be very, very cliched, but the connection to noticing and eyesight and observation, that's not going to go away. I'm always interested in, I've got my iPhone in front of me with a rather terrible case. I often, when I look at these, I often think of Fox Talbot, William Henry Fox Talbot, the British inventor of a certain version of photography that involved the negative. Well, one of his close friends was Charles Babbage, who's really the father of modern computing. And it's Babbage that is thinking about all information being able to be converted into ones and zeros, and that it could be used for calculation. So when I look at this, I think there's nothing in it that would actually surprise Fox Talbot, who was right there at the beginning of photography. And he'd probably have a nice chuckle at the fact that still there's at least one little black box with a piece of glass in front of it and a light-sensitive surface behind it. It's still got this little 19th century thing.
Yeah. Welcome to the show, David.
Oh, welcome. Yes, that's a nice word. Very early in the gray morning of Manhattan. Good to be here.
Yeah, and I'm joining you from a gray afternoon in Paris. So it sounds like we have common skies. I've been following your work for so long, and I talk to artists all the time, and your name comes up all the time, just in your writing and what it is that you do around photography. And I'm just so glad to have you on today. So I think we're going to have a great conversation. I always thought we would. I was like, I wonder if Dave would come on this show and we could talk a little photography. So thank you so much for coming. This is a treat for me.
Thanks for asking. It's always nice when people are interested in what you do. I never assume they are. So yeah, let's see where we go.
Well, you ask a lot of the same questions I do of photography, and maybe it's because I'm just a philosopher by nature. You know what I mean? I read a lot of philosophy, but I'm also engaged in this thing called photography, and I feel like I don't know if it's an overinflated importance on it because I think it's so important now to understand them, but I find that the things that you say or the things that you're thinking about are stuff that I find myself thinking about often. And I often have wanted to say, you know what, he and I should have a coffee one day or some wine in Paris and just, so now I got you on my show. So now I get the chance. So I'm really excited. But before we jump in headfirst into all the things that I would definitely want to ask you is go ahead and take a moment. For those that don't know you, I know a lot of people that do. So this might be for naught, but go ahead and take a moment and introduce yourself to the audience.
Oh, it's so hard to describe oneself. Well, I am creative director of the International Center of Photography in New York. And that's a role I've had for a short while, although I've been involved with ICP for a few years, 5 years now. But I also have a background in teaching. And I guess out in the world, I'm known as a curator of exhibitions and a writer and an editor. So I work quite a lot with photographers to help shape their books. I make images. It does not burn in my heart to be recognized as an artist or anything like that. But it's just another component it's another way of understanding photography, I guess, to actually be making it. And all of those things connect, and I knew they always would for me somehow. From very early on, actually, it was cinema that was my first love, not photography. And I knew I didn't really want to make films, although I have made films in the past. So there are other ways of being with it, thinking about it, reading, writing. Well, I've been involved with photography now for quite a while and in a number of different ways. And I think I've sustained that because I don't have a fixed idea of photography. I don't have a theory of photography. I don't think there is one. I think a lot of photographers, in identifying themselves as photographers, have a particular attitude to the medium. So I guess they have a theory of it for themselves. But I've never had that. And that itself is something that's fascinating about it. It's something I'm involved with, right? It seems to elude definition, at least for me, and that's a source of constant renewal. I think when I first got involved in photography, I figured it was going to be a hobby that was going to last 6 months, like, I don't know, train spotting or stamp collecting. But there's something about the constant renewal of it. And it's also to do with the fact that I don't have one kind of engagement with it. If you're a curator and a writer and a teacher, if you're doing all of those things, that also helps to keep it open somehow.
I would agree 100%. It's photography is evolving, but it's our fascination with images, period. The way we use them, even back before the invention of photography, we were using images as symbols, as ways of teaching, and but you could even take it even further back, even to the evolutionary biology. You can look at why we developed this sense called sight, and we as photographers, we play with that. We play with that sense. We try to tell you stuff with it, and so
it's interesting if you look back at the kind of history of people thinking about it, taking photography very, very seriously. You notice that it changes, particularly over the course of the 20th century. It changes a lot in relation to where photography sits within culture. When television came along and photography was kind of displaced from being, the defining visual form, when all of those great mass media magazines began kind of collapsing, there was a sense that photography was still around and it was still important, but it was somehow eclipsed. It was somehow slightly in the shadows. I don't think, probably from the 70s onwards, I don't think people would have said photography is the kind of definitive form of visual culture. I'm sure they would have said TV or video or... So I'm always interested in why and how photography survives. It's mute, generally speaking. We can argue about the kind of edges and the margins of where it blurs into other things, but there must be something appealing to individuals, but also to culture still, about the stillness and the muteness of it somehow.
It seems like it's when I think about all the people that I've read, Walter Benjamin and all these guys, they're all thinking about the photograph as an object, as an instrument, and I think to me, I always thought, why are we so obsessed with dissecting this thing? And it comes down to, I think, two things. Number one, it's like proving its merit as an art form, that the people that pick up this thing are trying to say, this is worthy of consideration.
Yeah.
But then the other part, go ahead. The second one, go ahead.
I think even on that point, the kind of arguing on behalf of photography for its artistic merit, I think is complicated because photography really becomes accepted as an art precisely at the point where art is questioning itself.
Right.
And a lot of the questions, in that kind of post-Duchamp way, shift from what is beautiful to what is art, and what is the relation between art and the rest of society and the rest of culture. And of course, photography doesn't. If you're a painter, you kind of belong to art. There aren't many other contexts in which to do it. There are some commercial outlets, but not, like painting theatre backdrops or whatever. But it's actually a tiny fragment of photographs that get made as and in the name of art, right? Sure. So the arguing for photography's artistic merit misses the fact that the energy in photography and the significance of photography for art, I think, comes from the fact that it can't entirely belong to art.
And that's then, I think, the second thing that I was going to lead to was there is a lot of people that are concerned with the image and its influence on power, the power to deceive, the power to tell the truth, questioning its authenticity or lack thereof. And I think those are the two main things that make us question. It's the one thing that made me do it. Me even start this was that AI is burgeoning influence on our society. I was just like, whoa. Photography has we as photographers have been thinking about this for a very long time, and then the proliferation of social media and image culture and how images now are being used to manipulate us and the power centers that are using them. It makes you question the image. It makes you want to. And I think photographers are at the forefront of that. I think that's the philosophers or people like you talking about that.
I agree with all of that, but I take a longer historical view about that.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go back to the 1920s, and you mentioned Walter Benjamin, but there are other writers and also artists that are thinking even at that point about photography's relation to power and politics and hegemony and the construction of people's perception of what society is and how it works and what its values are and all of that. That's not a consequence of AI or anything like that. And all of those words that people use now about image proliferation, we're flooded by images, we're inundated. You see those terms surface in the 20s and the 30s, and for very clear reasons. That the 20s is the period of the emergence of what we now call the mass media, right? Suddenly there's a flourishing of the illustrated magazines and newspapers. Cinema becomes a mass medium at that point. And there are people worried about there being, too many images. I can't get through a week without somebody telling me there are too many images in the world. And I often say this, but I'm always, when I hear that from people, I'm tempted to say, well, how many would you like? Or when did we reach kind of comfortable, optimal level? For me, at least, and this might be slightly counterintuitive, I don't think it's the number. I think the disturbance of photography is potentially in every single picture. I think every photograph gives you more than you bargain for. You open the shutter and the world as light floods in, or even if you hand those commands over to AI, the image is filling out itself. So that feeling of excess, and all images are ambiguous things, right? Images don't carry meanings, the way trucks carry coal. All of that ambiguity and disturbance and anxiety, I feel, is in every image. It's not to do with a quantity. I think the whole quantity thing is is a complete mistake. There were already too many images than you could ever see by, the 1850s.
You're exactly right. Yeah, we've been complaining about the exact same thing.
I mean, the history
you're exactly right.
The history of the complaint is fascinating, and I take the worry and the anxiety seriously. I'm not saying it's not a problem. I'm saying it's interesting that it's a problem with a history. But I think always part of the problem in discussing photography is we in the present always want to think that our problems are bigger and more original and more specific to our time and more rooted in the very latest technologies or mutations in culture than at any time before. And I think that amnesia is a problem. So I'm always interested in the history of the anxieties and also the excitements and the challenges we feel about photography. I mean, I did an exhibition at ICP here in New York called A Trillion Sunsets, and the subtitle was A Century of Image Overload. And it was a way of putting together work from the 20s right through to the 1920s to the 2020s. Not really a chronological show, but it did start with Hannah Hock, the German photomonteur. And she was looking at mass media magazines, and she made an album in the early 30s where she could see that certain image patterns were already very, very clear. How is sport represented? How are plants represented? How are animals represented? How are non-white people represented? What is female beauty? What is male beauty? And she was literally scanning the emerging landscape of visual culture in the 20s and 30s. And she was literally pulling these images together. Sounds like AI, putting these images together on the page of her scrapbooks. So you could see the patterns. Why is it that modernist architecture always gets represented in this kind of way? Why does conflict, war, always get represented in this kind of way? So those patterns, that we now think are somehow rooted in algorithms, that's just ideology. That's the conformism of ideology. And so you can look at the way certain ways of picturing things, visual formulas and shorthands emerged a long time ago, and they have a very heavy force on visual culture. They always have, and it's sometimes difficult to crawl out from the cliches or push through them into something else. It's true that AI has kind of refined that, but I think of AI as the perfecting of ideology. That's how I think about it. So that's something to push against or twist or subvert or find space within.
Perfecting of ideology. Wow, you got me there.
Seems obvious to me, but anyway.
Well, I can see when I'm thinking of I know a lot of visual language because I did come from a world of advertising, and you definitely have certain ways of using images in order to communicate your idea as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And we learn that kind of language in order to let you know that this is good and you should buy it, kind of thing. And I think, and you could do the same thing with ideology as well. And so what you're saying is that we already have a subset of visual language that was kind of already established throughout. I've always said her last name was Hausch. Was it Hauk or Hausch? Hannah Hausch. Yeah, I have been butchering that for years. I have been destroying that name for years. I apologize. So, but she was even noticing those commonalities, and I like how you also said shorthand is almost if it were little phrases that we use in order to communicate ideas, little things that we say to each other to say so this or that.
That's a catastrophe in a way, what you're pointing to there. That's the idea that George Orwell, the writer, was very interested in this. You know, if the moment you feel you are uttering a kind of pre-packaged phrase that you've just picked up from somewhere, at that point you've given up your agency and you're just repeating what's already out there. I think the French call it the langue du bois, the wooden tongue. You know, everybody knows those moments when they're uttering a phrase that they've not formulated for themselves. It's just a kind of received cliche that they've picked up. It's there in language, it's there in image making. We can't avoid it a lot of the time. But I'm super aware of it. I mean, I'm aware of it as a writer, and I'm aware of it when I'm looking at images. You know, the fact that, you know, we participate in language and we participate in visual culture. But if we karaoke our way through it, we're being lazy.
I love the karaoke reference. That is really, really nice. But then you say it's a refinement of ideology, AI. And so you could even say that about ChatGPT, how generic it can be.
Well, it's generic by definition, isn't it? Because of what it's pulling on and how it's pulling on it. I mean, the interesting thing now is we're at a point where even if we were to, we'd have to break down AI, and even if we
don't have to, not for this show.
Again, let's chat GPT, and it's something really simple that lots of people have used, like DALL-E, or, you know, a kind of a text prompt.
Mid-Journey, you could say.
That kind of thing. We're already past the golden era where the data sets that they were drawing on were non-AI.
Oh, yeah.
Visual culture is filling up with AI images. And it's a bit like, you know, the way a fly digests things. You know, it eats something, it vomits out. The digestion is taking place in front of it. It eats it again. It vomits it out. It eats it again. Sorry, it's a horrible metaphor, but that we're at that point.
No. I think it's a wonderful metaphor. I think all my listeners are going to love that.
It's going to stop people doing interesting or resistant things.
Yeah.
I'm not totalizing about it, but we're certainly and you know, all these big corporations are looking further and further afield for other data sets beyond the already regurgitated.
That is fascinating to think about.
But the thing about the already regurgitated is it doesn't stop you just photography is also connected with eyesight and looking. It may be computational as well, but it depends on whether you have what Jeff Wall calls an affection for the appearance of things. If you're actually interested in the way the world looks and the way the world looks to a lens and a camera of any kind, that directness of photography, I'm not saying it's authentic or anything like that, and it might still be very, very cliched, but the connection to noticing and eyesight and observation, that's not going to go away. I'm always interested in, I've got my iPhone in front of me with a rather terrible case. I often, when I look at these, I often think of Fox Talbot, William Henry Fox Talbot, the British inventor of a certain version of photography that involves the negative, as opposed to Niepce or Daguerre, where the images were unique. I mean, what's important about Fox Talbot is the negative and reproduction potentially unlimited reproduction. Well, one of his close friends was Charles Babbage, who's really the father of modern computing. And it's Babbage that is thinking about all information being able to be converted into ones and zeros, and that it could be used for calculation. And people have made connections between photography and things like weaving and the loom, and that the loom is a kind of primitive computer, punch cards and all of that kind of stuff. So when I look at this, I think there's nothing in it that would actually surprise Fox Talbot, who was right there at the beginning of photography, and he'd probably have a nice chuckle at the fact that still there's at least one little black box with a piece of glass in front of it and a light-sensitive surface behind it. It's still got this little 19th century thing.
Yeah.
That is receptive to the light bouncing off the world, and that's kind of fascinating. I think that's. Well, maybe it comes back to this question of photography. It's kind of escaping definition because its purposes can never be fixed. The relation between definition and purpose is really fascinating, because I think if you ask people what photography is, if you go out into the street and ask people what photography is, the definition they'll give you will be related to what they use it for.
That's exactly right. It comes from its utilization or the practice of.
But of course, we're always discovering other things you can do with it, right? The program, as Willem Flusser calls it, it is never complete, and it's never fully set in advance. I mean, just if you think about, if you ask people, let's say in the late 1940s, if you ask them what photography was, particularly in Europe and America, they would have connected it very, very strongly with memory and evidence. Evidence because of the war, memory because of the traumatic disturbances of the war. Too.
In the handheld camera.
Yeah, my teenage daughters don't necessarily think about it that way. They probably think that the objects in their world are as much, indexes of certain memories and experiences as images somehow. But of course, it's a horrible thought, but let's say they lost one of their friends. They would be scrambling through their phone for the images of that friend, and suddenly photography would appear to them as doing something very, very different, maybe something more like the 1940s. So I was talking to some people from that are making a film about Leica, the camera company. And the whole of the premise, as we were discussing it, around the Leica was, the decisive moment. The lightweight camera, where you can move through the world in this fluid way, and you can collapse the distance between noticing and picture making almost into the same instant. And the world starts to be understood as instants that can be sort of extracted. But then I raised the question of the other things you could do with a Leica. So, for example, the Californian artist Louis Baltz made an amazing set of photographs of the facades of industrial buildings, industrial parks in California. Most people, when they look at those pictures, think, oh, well, they must have been taken on a large format camera because they're so detailed and they're so formal and rectilinear, and there's no instant there, that they are not shutter pictures freezing the world. But he just didn't want to lug around a 4x5 camera, and he found he could use the Leica to make those pictures. Well, that tells you a lot, actually. That tells you that
tells you a lot.
That the camera doesn't prescribe how it should be used. Its program is open-ended. Its protocol is open-ended. Sorry, that sounded like a mini lecture, but I think about those.
Oh no, all these things are things that I often think about, and now I think in a lot of ways I'm very curious a little bit about you. We jumped right in concepts and ideas, but I'm curious a little bit about you. Like you said, from a very young age, you kind of were attracted to photography, but you also knew that you weren't. You just realized early that you could engage with photography in different ways. And what was it about it that made it kind of the center of attention, or did it?
Well,
I'm just curious about that origin story, how you got here.
Well, the interesting thing about origin stories is they become attractive and people retell them. And I don't know. I can give you the origin story, but you will have to take it with a pinch of salt. There's a lot of truth in it, but I'm sure there's lots of things I'm missing out. So,
of course,
I grew up really kind of in the middle of nowhere. But interestingly, it was in a hotel. My parents ran a hotel, and it overlooked an estuary, the Thames estuary, where the river that flows through London meets the sea. So very, very beautiful light. So I think that's where the interest in light came from, for sure. But British television showed, and we only had 3 channels and then a 4th one in the early 80s. I'm showing my age here. They all showed amazing movies, like the 20th century canon. So Hitchcock and Ozu and Kurosawa and Bergman and Varda and Fellini and the Czech New Wave and the Soviet avant-garde and you name it. So there is a group of us of a certain kind of age that got seriously interested in culture around that time. And that if we didn't get a good cultural education from school, we'd get it from watching these movies.
Oh, wow.
And 2 things happened. One, that opened my eyes. That just really opened my eyes about image making, about other cultures. And it sent me in 2 directions. One was up to London to buy books about movies. I lived about 30 miles from London. And I kind of got very interested in the photographs in those books about movies. And I kind of liked them more than the movies sometimes. But this was also the moment of the emergence of home video. And what I really liked about home video was not that you could record things off the TV, onto a cassette. What really interested me was the pause button. The fact that you could watch a movie and just say, stop.
Oh, yeah.
And just look at that frame. The sound disappears. The story disappears. The motion disappears. And you're reducing cinema to, just one of the 24 photos per second. That was in retrospect, I hope it's not too much of an origin story, but that was quite profound. I have really strong memories of like watching Fellini's 8.5 and just stopping it and just thinking, that is an amazing picture. I don't even need to watch the whole film. people take screenshots all the time, and it's lovely. I love the idea of screenshots.
You have such a beautiful turn of phrase. I just I'm just a big fan of it. So go ahead. I was going to ask you about your parents. Pick it up from there.
Okay. Yeah, it was a kind of benign neglect. They liked the fact nobody had gone to university in my family, so they were excited about the fact that I was going to go do a degree, and it was going to be in photography and filmmaking, but also a lot of theory, kind of half writing, half image making. So they weren't in a position to be churlish about the fact that this is what I was going to study. Geez, you're the first in the family to go to university of Urbanaut. Photography, doesn't everybody do photography? So they never objected. And yeah, I had a darkroom at home, and I taught myself about, the making of images and printing and all of that. And yeah, my dad at one point said, that's a nice photo. Maybe one of the Sunday magazines, Sunday newspaper magazines, they used to publish a picture that maybe somebody sent in, full page, and he said, "Oh, you should send it in." Anyway, he persuaded me to do it, and then 6 weeks later, he came running into my bedroom on Sunday morning, like holding it up. Yeah, you're in the paper. This is amazing. Which is amazing. When you're 18 and it's not fame or anything like that, but you're suddenly made aware that images can circulate, right? They're not. Yeah. They might not be just one-off things that you print in the darkroom for yourself, but they're reproducible in a way that keeps their essential qualities. Actually, the way when a painting is photographed and reproduced in a magazine. It doesn't really keep its essential qualities. So I remember being aware that photography was essentially reproductive somehow. Of course, there are exceptions. But I remember thinking, I remember going to a newsstand and seeing like a pile of this magazine and thinking, Jesus, like every one of these magazines has this picture in it that I made in the darkroom. And of course, that made me think about all the other pictures I was looking at. They were made and they were probably printed, or they were transparencies. And there's a kind of currency and a circulation. Sorry, there's sirens outside my Manhattan.
No, it's big city life. I get them constantly. We were talking about that today, and I take a French class, and that's exactly what we were saying. C'est bruyant, very loud. I'm used to it. It's fine. I love it. It's ambiance.
Yeah, it's on. Yes, it's nice when you have those experiences quite young, to be published. I suppose also before the era of the internet and sort of self-publishing. It's quite an interesting experience to go through that. And then when I was studying, there was this feeling that how is this work going into the world? Are we just making the work for the crits to put up on the wall for each other to discuss? Do I want to be an exhibiting artist? I ended up with a very good friend actually making work on public billboards when I was a student, image text things, which is a different kind of public presence from something like a mass media magazine. So I think from early on I was interested in experimenting with those things, trying those things.
I think it's interesting. I love that story about your father running in. You say, "Hey, look, that worked." There's a part of that too, that you get that acknowledgement from the family, and also it's like, especially you chose a direction that was, not. I hear this a lot from photographers that when they tell their parents, "Hey, I want to do photography," they go, "You want to do what?" It's so like they have to kind of bring them along, but to have that kind of validation, it was probably really good. It probably felt good. But then also, it feeds the beast. Once you get that bug, then it goes. And I often feel like I don't personally, I'm not a golfer, but I'm going to use an analogy here. But there's a lot of people that I knew that do golf, and they talk about this one moment that they had while golfing that makes them go back all the time. And I feel like that with photography. I had a few of those moments with a camera, and I've just been obsessed ever since. Yeah. And in making and looking and reading and engaging and talking and all these different things. And so I'm always curious would you say that was a defining moment? And if there was another one,
well, this is where origin stories get complicated, isn't it? Because what people
I love origin stories. I like them.
What people like the simplicity, but the more I think about it, the more I realize how many components there were.
Absolutely.
Another one was the fact that a few villages away, there was a secondhand bookstore, not very big. And I went in there maybe aged 15, 16. And there just happened to be amazing photography books. So the first photography I saw was Diane Arbus, Lee Friedlander, Cartier-Bresson, William Klein, Walker Evans, Bill Brandt, Lisette Model. I remember seeing very early on and being very impressed by. And it takes you a while to realize that you've gone in at a very, very high level. They're all very good. Of course, people do a million different things with photography that can all be very good. But if you see work of a very high standard at a very young age, you feel there are going to be endless vistas of that kind of quality and that standard. And maybe there aren't, but maybe there are other things. I soon fell into conceptual art and postmodern things, and which were also fascinating and also interesting. So it wasn't just those kind of 20th century observational poet photographers that I saw earlier. All kinds of things, but to be exposed to really great things. I mean, another part of the origin story is that I ended up towards the end of my student days working at the ICA, the Institute of Contemporary Arts, and as well as great exhibitions. They had a cinema, they had a public talks program. I met Susan Sontag when I was very spent an afternoon with her. I met a lot of my favorite filmmakers. It was lucky. Looking back, it was lucky. So I can tell a quick origin story, but it's really a constellation of things. But those early experiences don't mean anything unless they either keep renewing or the door stays open to other things. It's always been amazing teaching because I'm constantly surprised at how students understand photography. That never stays the same. Never does. There's a renewal in that. And the reason it doesn't stay the same is kind of obvious. It's not just a technological thing. It's to do with the fact that the world is changing all the time.
Constantly. Yeah. The way we use them, the way we consume them, the way we surround ourselves with them. Yeah. Go ahead.
Origin stories they tend to kind of congeal things as if your DNA was set then. And everything else is, it's a bit Hollywood. It's a bit Hollywood for me, but I like it. It does make me think a lot about what were early influences and how have they changed? How have those things that first made an impression.
I'm always curious. I'm just absolutely curious about how people get to where they are, and how they tell that story. Really, to me, I know it's condensed. I have 2 hours with you, and I have more questions, but I'm always just curious where people get that curiosity from, why somebody researches it. And we all have these interesting moments. And personally, I'm a storyteller, so I like the story. So I tell stories all the time. So I'm also, you are also very, I'm going to talk about your writing a little bit later, but you also have been curating. And you're a very well-known curator. And I've always wanted to ask you, number one, how did you get into it? And then number two, what were some influential moments curating that meant a lot to you? Some shows, and we can even look at some if you want to on your website or what have you.
Well, I started going to see exhibitions around the age of 17, coming up to London. So I went to the Photographers Gallery and the Barbican. I remember seeing the Eugene Smith show, the photojournalist. And I remember thinking, wow, these are kind of amazing prints in frames on walls. But then the captions would say things like, this image was part of a photo essay in Life magazine. And I remember thinking, well, I really want to see Life magazine. It's nice to see this print on the wall, but this was clearly not his first context. That made an impression. And I had like 10, 12, 15 years probably of just seeing a lot of exhibitions before anyone ever asked me to make an exhibition. And I've not actually been curating that long. Started around 2010, just out of the blue. Three different opportunities came along at once, just asking me. And people are probably rolling their eyes like, oh yeah, he just got asked to make shows. I did. I could say that I had been writing a lot.
Yeah.
And I had a way of writing that was a little bit curatorial in this and a little bit kind of editorial.
Yeah.
I would, when I was making books or writing essays for magazines, I would select and sequence the images first. So I would literally make sure with the editors that I could have, let's say, those 6 images or 20 images or 140 images in a book, whatever. And I would sequence them. And that would be the backbone for the writing. There aren't many writers that do that. And it means the writing is very much led by the images. I'm not just choosing images to sort of illustrate points or there's a kind of visual track to the way I like to write. And I think that made a number of people think, oh, maybe he could curate.
Yeah, he's curator.
I can see that he's thinking about individual images and not over defining what they could mean, and he's thinking about the relationships between them. And I'd also developed, and you mentioned this earlier, I'd also developed quite a clear way of writing about quite complex ideas, and that had come out of teaching. That had come out of, how do you do that when you're standing in front of a room of, 18, 19-year-olds? How get across something quite complicated? The best and the most stimulating way you can without being off-putting or obscure It's not always possible, but that was always a kind of force. And I think that kind of clarity helped when people were asking if I'd like to curate shows. And then things kind of snowballed and other opportunities came along. But when I joined ICP here in New York, that was really my first institutional job. I'd always curated as a freelancer, a particular place would ask me to do a show, and I'd go there and look at it and figure out what I could do. And I've never actually been in a position where I've had to, again, people are going to roll their eyes, propose shows. I always tried to do things if people asked. I don't pitch that much writing. Offers to do things come into my inbox, and I can't do them all, but I pick and I choose them. So although I've kind of freelanced as a writer and a curator, I've never really had to be out there in the world pitching things. I do occasionally. Sometimes I have passion projects that I really want to make happen, and I'll put a lot of effort into trying to get those things into the world. It's been quite fortunate.
I think that's interesting. It kind of started with writing with you. And I think a lot of people want to get to the end there. They have curator in mind, but I think what I loved about what you were saying there was you were already doing the writing. You were already simplifying the ideas. I hate saying simplify.
Oh, it's not simplifying.
Decoding, contextualizing. You're already doing it.
Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, said, all ideas should be expressed in the simplest way possible. That doesn't mean all ideas are simple.
Agreed.
But we have an obligation to make them, to get them to their simplest point. That doesn't mean you're
digestible.
It doesn't mean you're oversimplifying. Also, if you manage to state something really well, it has a very interesting effect on people. They might not appreciate it, but something's happening.
Yeah, for sure.
Also, I've always gone to public lectures and watched public speakers. And that's a real art. That's a real skill that not many people have. To be able to stand up in public and not hesitate, deviate, or repeat, as they say on Radio 4. And to carry your ideas along and carry the audience with you so they feel they are doing the thinking with you in real time. That's an amazing thing. And a lot of my writing, I try to test on the ear. If it doesn't sound good to the ear, I have to try and rework it somehow. I don't find writing easy at all. It's painful. It's a strange thing, writing. It's an act of communication, and you do it alone, absolutely alone. And there must be something about that I like. Most of the time it feels painful, to be honest. But if you get yourself to a point where you're writing quite a lot, and it doesn't matter whether you're publishing, doesn't matter whether your writing's got a presence out there in the world. If you get to a point where you're writing a lot, what happens is you get yourself to a place where you kind of don't really know what you think about things until you've written about them. So you begin into
you were saying things that I just absolutely love, and I couldn't agree with that more. I absolutely say that to people. I'm like, sometimes I'm my most mixed up when I haven't written something in a while, and then I just go ahead.
it can be very, very clarifying, but it can also mean that you're then dependent upon it. And
maybe I am.
I remember when I first joined ICP, there's a lot to do. We had a very slimmed down staff. My days were very, very long, and I wasn't getting to write, and I was getting a little tetchy, a little anxious. And I actually checked in with a therapist, and online. This was kind of pandemic era. And at one point she said, are you writing? And I said, no, there's no time in the day for that. And she said, well, maybe you should. I said, I can't. My days are 10, 12 hours. And she said, well, it seems like you're dependent on the writing now. Get up a bit earlier. So I would get up at 5, and I would write between sort of 5:30 and 7:30. When I was kind of sane again and manageable again. And I thought, oh gosh, I thought writing was something I could just pick up and put down whenever. But it is a part of how I am in the world and how my thinking takes place. I mean, looking at images and working with images is part of that too.
It's a difference in my opinion. I do both, right?
Right.
However, photography is something I can pick up and put down, but my writing is not. I often see that they're married together. I didn't realize that until years later, and I started going through, and I started to notice my stories were lining up with my images, and I was like, "What is going on here?" And then I started to realize a lot of my work is very personal. It's almost diaristic in a way. So it's really, really interesting. I really like this idea of that path through writing into curation. And you said that was there one particular show that you curated that meant a lot to you, or you felt contributed to the kind of the larger dialogue that needed to be had? Is there anyone that stands out to you that means a lot to you?
From those early shows that I did, can you see that?
We can take a look right now. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, yeah. Okay, this is my website, which was designed for me by a really lovely ex-student. His firm is called Good Caesar.
I love that name. Yeah, love that.
I've gone into the kind of curatorial tab. Okay. There's an amazing institution in Paris called Le Bal, which was opened in 2010. And the woman who set it up there, Diane Dufour, she'd read something of mine. She'd read a book called Photography and Cinema. And she came to London and she wanted to meet me. And she told me that she was setting up this place and it was going to be dedicated to the document in the expanded sense. I thought, wow, that's amazing. And would I...
Ambitious.
Would I co-curate with her the opening show? And I did. And it was around that very strong strand of... depiction in North American culture of anonymous people on the street or workers, and it was a show exploring what anonymity is. I mean, nobody's really anonymous. You're only anonymous for or to someone else. So anonymity was a very kind of relational thing. And the interesting thing about it was we had photographic work that was made for exhibition spaces. I think you can see a Jeff Wall picture there. Search bonuses. We had work that was made for magazines. We had work that was made for screens. And we wanted them all together and in a relation to each other. So while it was an exhibition space, we both understood that exhibition spaces were a place set aside from culture where you could bring things past and present from all of photography's different contexts and platforms. And if you were careful, you could put them into a relation to each other. And I'd maybe done a couple of small shows before that. And but the interesting thing is that invitation came out of somebody reading one of my books, came out of somebody reading Photography and Cinema, which I think came out the year before this book. Which is now in a number of different languages, which is nice in retrospect. It's just made me think about that it was a book that led to that opportunity. And I've always tried with exhibitions to not repeat myself too much, but always to be thinking about the space of exhibition, not just as a space of art, capital A, but a space to which you can bring photography's various forms and put them into a relationship with each other. If there's something distinctive, I think, about the way I curate, it's maybe that somehow. I'm trying to think of another good example. This was a show I did at ICP during the pandemic, where the gallery was closed, and ICP invited people to upload images with a hashtag, just so maybe we could see what was going on all around the world during those first months of the pandemic. We decided we would make an exhibition, even if the space couldn't open to the public. We did eventually open to the public. And so we were selecting images, reaching out to the photographers, and eventually we had 820 pictures from 820 photographers in 70 or 71 different countries. And I remember putting this show up. There's caption information on the printed sheet. It's largely to do with the pandemic, but then it fell into imagery around the Black Lives Matter movement and protest because George Floyd was.
Yeah, there was a lot of energy around that at that time.
Yeah. And so it was a show that was really on its feet. But I think what interested me was that these were images that started online, actually, on Instagram screens. And now they were on walls and they were prints. And then eventually, after the show was up, it became a book. So this is just spreads from the book. So I love the fact that those same images went screen, wall, page. And they meant something, and they functioned and they worked perfectly well in each of those contexts. And I do think about photography having this easy, sometimes too easy relation to whatever context it's in. You know, if you see a painting in a book, you know that the painting is somewhere else, right?
Yeah.
And that you're looking at a reproduction.
Yes.
If you pick up, I don't know, Robert Frank's The Americans or Gillian Laub's latest book, you're not thinking, where are those photographs? They just inhabit the page. They belong to the page in the same way that they belong to a billboard or they belong to a screen. Not always, and I'll show you something that's quite the opposite of all of this. But I am fascinated in that the idea that photographs can live in different ways. That can be very disturbing, and it can get very confusing. And there are photographers that only want to make books. There are photographers that only want to make exhibitions. There are photographers that only want their work in magazines. But most of the time, contemporary photographers are thinking about their work having multiple, they're thinking about a book and an exhibition, or how work made for magazines ends up in a book or ends up in a show. That to me is part of the currency of photography. But I did do a show that was kind of the opposite of that. promiscuity in a way. I did a show called Actual Size, where everything, I'll get to some install shots. There weren't many things in the show, maybe about 15 or 16 things, but they were all photographs that were the same size as what they were of. Most photographs make things smaller. You know, you can photograph a mountain.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sometimes they make things bigger, but 1-to-1, like actual size, is a very special scale. And we even had a Greyhound bus in the show, an image of a Greyhound bus. It was the size of a Greyhound bus. And something very, very interesting happens when you're standing in front of an actual size image, or you're seeing an actual size image in a magazine. When I was very, very young, 7 or 8, I saw a piece in a magazine which had the fists of the boxers, Muhammad Ali and George Foreman, reproduced actual size. In fact, I managed to get hold of a copy and we included it in this show. And I remember putting my timid little fist against Ali's fist on the page. And that was such a visceral connection, you know, that the image was or like a facsimile, almost like a scan or a photocopy of his actual hand. I mean, I had to trust the fact that it was actual size and it said actual size on the page. Photographs can't guarantee these things on their own. But that means that in fact, these photographs don't even work as installation shots. You kind of had to be there to see all of these things.
And feel the relationship between you and the object itself. It's a felt experience versus
they're very diverse pictures. Like you're looking at something by Marcuse there, and then Aspen Mays and Manuel Franquelo, and this is by Paola Peavy. Totally different in subject matter, but they all belong to each other through their scale. And this is not me deciding these works should be presented at this scale. These were works made and conceived at that scale. And so they have a one-to-one relation to their subject matter. They have a one-to-one relation to the space that they're in. They have a one-to-one relationship to each other, a one-to-one relationship to the body of the viewer. But most of the time, photography plays fast and loose with scale and dimension. You know, you flip through a magazine or go through a website, you know, here's a mountain, here's a fingernail, here's a car, here's Beyonce. And we're mentally changing scale all the time as we look at those things. We know Beyonce is not 11 inches tall or whatever.
And that's all relation. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, because I say this often, but you know, if you're a painter, you don't paint your painting and then decide how big it will be. But you paint the painting at the size that it is.
Yeah.
With photography, there's capture and there's output. There are exceptions, you know, like photograms or Polaroids. I get that, of course. And there are digital painters, you know, who paint on screen and they get to print their work at whatever size they like. But generally speaking, photography does not have this essential or sovereign relation to scale or material. It just doesn't. And that means photography is very elastic and you can do many things with it. And that's very perplexing and very overwhelming and also very exciting for photographers, but also for curators. And there's a long history of this. There's a very long history of experimentation with all of these things.
I really enjoy playing with the referential, you know, it's a reference to something, especially when you alter its scale. It's not the actual thing, nor is it, it's just evidence of a thing. If there is such a thing as evidence. And so when you curate, are you thinking, this is very philosophical. You're you say. It's are these the types of questions you like to ask? Make an audience think? Is this kind of, because I love that actual size show, because you're almost breaking we consume images. You're now making someone feel something, and being confronted with the reference in a way.
So
And
one would hope you can do that. I try to do it without ever using a photograph or an artwork as just a tool for a concept.
that's
I'm very respectful of the work that's in the show, particularly the thematic show around a particular idea. Actually, if I go back to that one I was just showing you, I can give you an interesting little anecdote. If I enlarge this, it's not great resolution. Okay, just want to talk about this work here, which is by an artist called Ace Lehner, non-binary, and they're very interested in the relationship between performativity and non-binary experience and representation. And I think it's the only work they have made that was conceived as actual size. So it's a photographic image of two people in a tree, and you can't assign them any kind of gender or sexuality. It's a very deliberately ambiguous picture, and the scroll of the image comes out onto the floor. And as it comes out of the floor, the image, the kind of leaves on the floor of the forest are out of focus. So it has this lovely relation to scale and space and flatness and depth. But if you know anything about Ace Lehner, who's written a lot, they're a professor. Most of the work appears in contexts to do with the non-binary, right? But I wrote to Ace and said, look, maybe it's a crazy idea. I'd like to include this one piece you made called Kissing in a show about actual size images. And it'll be next to a Jeff Wall, which is the black and white one. And the big scroll coming out onto the floor on the left there is a piece by Paula Peavy. And I said, are you okay in that kind of context? And they said, okay. I only ever get put in shows about, new directions in non-binary portraiture. That's an amazing context to be in. And that was really heartening for me, because I thought, that's great. That they're, very often photographic artists find that they get pigeonholed, or they're asked to over-define themselves for the market or for the cultural landscape that they're in. And I really like suggesting that there are other ways to think about these questions. You can have that relation to that image in terms of its depiction of gender and sexuality. I'm not treading on that. And I like the fact that people might discover that in a show that's purportedly is about actual size and that scale. But there are other things going on at the level of subject matter. So yeah, I don't find these obscure questions that I'm interested in. I think they're quite essential questions to do with photography and representation. They don't feel to me like I'm going out on some strange limb. I know when people came to see this actual size show, they were like, oh, wow, yeah, I've sort of thought about that, but not really. And I've never seen a show in which everything is actual size. Like, why have I never seen that before? Also, if I was to be indulgent, I want to make shows that I really want to see. Nothing wrong with that, right?
Yeah.
That's quite an important impulse. I'm not just a kind of cultural servant, but I do know that my interests overlap with other people. I'm not in some weird ivory tower. I'm not a populist either. I know that that's quite an idiosyncratic and quite smart show, but I also know that that's quite a generous show and a suggestive show, and there are lots of different ways into it.
I really like the multi-dimensionality. I'm having a hard time with it. It's got multi-dimensions in it.
Yeah.
Where it can be perceived and looked at it in different ways. I really enjoy experiences like that. It seems, do you feel like, and this could be just your own, this could be a critic's opinion from you. Do you feel like sometimes sometimes like the art world and sometimes shows that are curated can be singular in its motive? It kind of seems flat in that regard. I've noticed that a lot, and I just felt like I was just being overly critical. I was curious about your opinion on that.
Well, it's interesting. I remember talking a few years ago with the artist Jeff Wall about this. And he said something interesting happened with cultural institutions around the turn of the millennium. They went from thinking that art can be for anyone to thinking that they must be for everyone. Subtle difference there. Can be for anyone, must be for everyone. And it was well intended, cultural institutions should be inclusive, they shouldn't be high-minded, but within that was a kind of drive towards populism.
Yeah.
And populism often means oversimplifying things, not allowing people the space of ambiguity that is one of the gifts of art, actually. I don't mean by ambiguity just a kind of obscurity or difficulty, but the fact that different people are going to have different responses to it, and all of those responses are important.
Some of my favorite films do that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And I think the one dimensionality that you're talking about is where the exhibitions get over-scripted. That there's a kind of anxiety about ambiguity, so that's to be avoided. And the shows get packaged in a particular way where there's what I've called in the past a kind of script for looking.
You're literally putting words to my thoughts. That is exactly how I feel sometimes.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating.
Part of it is to do with that's how photographs operate most of the time in society, right?
Yeah, I can.
News pictures are, generally speaking, are not there for their ambiguity. They will be ambiguous if you take the text away. Same as advertising pictures or fashion pictures or whatever it is. But I feel that the kind of mental and cultural movement that happens with ambiguity is the only way that culture moves. Otherwise, it's just a curator or an institution saying, I think this is what the public wants at this point in time. Let's give it to them. And that looks like it's responsive and inclusive, but it's also patronizing, and it's limiting at precisely the point where it thinks it's opening things up. All of this is a very, very delicate balance, and I think about these questions, and we talk about these questions all the time at ICP. I think about them when I'm writing. I'm phrasing it in a simple way, but this is complicated, and it's one of the most pressing points in culture at the moment. How do you get people to slow down? How do you get people to value their own response?
No, you were saying something about, and I really want you to kind of take that idea of ambiguity. You were talking about, you were talking about it. Its role, and correct me here. His role is to explore that. I personally, I like the word of subtlety. I love that. My favorite works and my favorite bodies of works that I just, they're seminal in my mind. They play with subtlety, the subtlety of the human experience, the subtlety of an emotion, how it manifests itself, the subtlety of tradition, creeping into everything. These kinds of things, and you were talking about that's the role of, you said, to play in ambiguity. Can you expand on that a little bit more? What do you mean by that? I think you did a good job already to a degree, but like expand on that idea of institutions and their role in that.
I remember in the early 2000s, where the internet was coming to dominate cultural life, everyday life. Museums suddenly thought that they had to be like the internet. Almost like the inside of the internet. If you look at like internet culture or internet art, it was almost like a kind of 3D manifestation of like many windows being open at once, and
the Louvre feels like that to me sometimes.
Somehow the museums thought they had to replicate the distraction and the chaos, but actually the internet's very good at being the internet. That's true. Whereas, if you're asking people to kind of leave their home or leave their place of work and come to a space, that's a kind of a pilgrimage, not being overly religious about it. And so you have to live up to a kind of architectural and a spatial experience. Obviously, it's something like the Actual Size show was really trying to do that. That's an experience you could only have if you went to that show. I mean, I feel all exhibitions should be exhibitions that you can only experience as exhibitions, right?
Right.
But once you're there, that doesn't mean the meaning of anything is kind of pinned down. I can think of images that have meant a lot to me, like over the years, and that I've looked at over the years, and I've seen them maybe in different contexts. And I realized that while the image is fixed, the meaning is not completely. They stay the same and we change.
Exactly.
And it's why, sometimes people when they're feeling a little bit kind of insecure, they want to return to the works of culture that mean the most to them. Go watch your favorite movie. Go listen to your favorite album. As if there's a kind of home base that you can go to and have that exact experience again. It's never quite the same.
Never.
And actually, what's reassuring is that it is never quite the same.
I would agree with that.
And so something nice happens when you accept that. And I feel this even about, books that I've edited, when I've helped a photographer edit their work. I was looking again at a book that was only made about 5 years ago. And it doesn't mean the same thing to me that I thought it did when I was putting it together. Still good, still interesting. So I just accept that meaning is not that fixed.
And that's what you mean by that ambiguity. I couldn't agree with you more. My girlfriend often looks at me and says, how many times have you watched this movie? I'm like, I don't know, 7, 8. But I get something out of it every time, different, or see if it's a good one. It's a good film.
No, so I can be absolutely honest here. Probably the best example I can think of is watching as a teenager. And I don't think, although my mother was quite a strong character, my sister were, I don't think I could have called myself a feminist at that age. And I remember watching Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo. And I remember thinking, oh, this is an interesting movie about, a very stable, solid guy who's being duped into falling in love with someone who's actually pretending to be someone else. And oh, poor Jimmy Stewart, And then I watched it 5 or 6 years later, and I see how neurotic and cruel and manipulative he is, right?
Mm-hmm.
You learn something, and you learn something because you've changed, and I think that film in particular is something that it's now regarded as being one of the most extraordinary films ever made, and I think it's because as people watch it at different points in their life, it means different things. You can marvel at how beautifully constructed it is, and beautifully shot and acted, and the kind of Swiss watch-like precision of its narrative construction and its folding and its repetitions and all of that. But a lot changes if you're prepared to change. A lot changes when you watch it again, and that makes you think, well, what is the meaning of this film or this photograph or this artwork? Meaning doesn't come out of artworks like rains and
Somehow weird. Yeah.
respond, and the meaning of the work is our response to it.
It's the response. Yeah, absolutely.
When a reviewer says this movie is a failure, or this, and I just thought, how do you know? What if someone thinks it's not?
Yeah.
Someone's getting something out of it that you're not. I mean, I love the best thing about being a curator is you can do a show that has great reviews and is really well attended, and you still don't really know what the thought process actually is of the people in the space. So,
or what they get out of it. Yeah.
What they get out of it. And so often I like to spend time in the shows, in the exhibitions, sort of incognito, just watching people. How long are they spending with work? Are they looking around and connecting this thing over here with this thing over here? Are they talking to their friends? How long are they spending? And you still don't know. And even if I go up and ask someone, I've changed the terms. Now they feel they have to turn it into words and give you an account, and something's been lost when they do that. So there's always something very mysterious about how people make sense of things. That's what I mean by ambiguity. It's not something I sort of fetishize as. I just think it's the way of things.
This question of ambiguity, and I like what you were saying there. It's not like I'm sold on it. It's just the way things are. I totally agree with that. And if you're open to growth, you realize that.
Yeah.
I think if you're open to growing as that person, you start to understand that that aspect of it. I often talk to young people a lot, and I say, don't decide yet what you are. Just let life change you. You'll find out. You know what I mean? You don't have to decide anything. And just so many people are in a hurry to define things. And life doesn't let you, unfortunately, as we want to. But that's, I think that's really interesting. But I'm also, you kind of talked a little bit about your curation, the kind of the way you think in that regard. And I'm curious about you. You're also a very very good editor in photo books, and you get asked to do this in collaboration with artists all the time. And I was a little curious about your thoughts on that. I was thinking about, in the future, possibly doing a retreat type thing where we focused on photo books. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are there. And I guess we could start off here. Do you feel like, first off, let's look at the world of photo books. Do you feel like we're seeing this like boom of photo books right now? It seems like they're the new hot thing. Yeah. Everybody wants one. All artists are striving to have one. Do you feel that?
Oh, for sure. There's definitely a renaissance or a boom, and there are metrics for that. It's quite clear that there are more photo books being made now than at any other point. When there were fewer being made, they tended to be in larger print runs. So you could say that it's a little bit kind of boutique now. And it's great that photographers want to do that. They're not all going to be great things, but I'm glad that they're making them. Keeps them off the streets. It's my slight worry is it's become a form, or it's like a category. I don't even like the word photo book. I remember quite a few years ago now, I wrote a little text, which is on my website. It's called "What's in a Name?" And nobody really used the word photo book until really the turn of the century, 1999, 2000. You start seeing it, and it became something that people studied. There were kind of classes in it. Suddenly there was like a canon. People were like publishing books about the best photo books, or the best Dutch photo books, or the Japanese photo books. But canons were being assembled, and canons require certain kind of criteria. But I always thought it was a strange thing to turn into a category. And in that little essay I wrote, which is a sort of a little provocation, I said, well, how come so many interesting books got made without even using that term? And nobody would use the term word book to put together all books with words.
We did have pop-up book, though. Don't forget the 90s, the pop-up book.
Novelists say, I'm making a word book.
True.
Photo book is a very peculiar kind of term. But anyway, it's amazing. I think there are books being made now that are as good and as interesting as at any point in the history of making them. I got involved with them at a certain point. And it's true that I get asked by photographers and artists if I'd either like to help them or look at them. So the most extreme examples is where the photographer says, David, I really appreciate books, really good books when I see them, but I've no idea how they're made, and I've got no impulse to do it myself, but I would really like there to be a good book of this project that I'm working on. And that can be as bold as them just sending me 2,000 images and saying, is there a book in there? Sometimes it's more of a kind of conversation. But I think the best work that I've done for me as an editor is kind of without ego. What do I mean by that? I think when you look at a bunch of pictures, you first of all have a kind of impulse to say, well, I like this, or I like this, or this should go with this, or this should be the design, or this should be the kind of rhythm. That's often just preference. And I do that, and then I junk it. I put it aside. And then I have to ask myself, what kind of book would this photographer make with this work if they were, excuse me, if they were able to make a book? What is the form that feels truest to it somehow? It's a little game you have to play with yourself to get yourself into that framework. And then it does feel like it's not an egotistical thing or preference. It does feel like I'm able to understand the work well enough to help give it the form that somehow it feels it needs. I can't really put it better than that.
I think you did a good job. I think what you were saying there is being, as someone that does editing, or someone that goes through 2,000 images and you pick out your best one, you find your selects.
Yeah.
You sometimes when it's overwhelming, you want to go initially to the aesthetic, the composition, and you go, that's a good one, that's a good one, that's a good one, and that's a good one. But I like what you said there about like kind of getting yourself out of that, and then just kind of leaning into kind of the entire body of the work, and trying to respect the body of the work, and allowing that body of work to kind of express itself out as best as possible without your initial going, I like that image, I like that. That's a really good tip. I think what I'm curious about is a book in itself is also a limiting factor as much as a frame is, or a gallery space is. And
sure, but I think all great work comes out of its limitations.
Talk to me about that. What do you mean by
necessity?
In regards to books,
necessity being the mother of invention, and books are quite elastic, but they also have certain kind of properties, and you have to kind of work with those. And then there are kind of economic things. I'm really interested in books that are able to reach beyond the audience for photo books, right? Again, this is the problem of the term. I remember I was doing a book. I was asked to do a book with Aperture. I'll just find it on my website. Did a book about photographic road trips. It was done like a decade ago. I wouldn't do it like this now, but that doesn't matter in a way. And it was about a kind of post-Robert Frank history of photographers making bodies of work on the road in various ways. And I wrote an essay, which was visually structured. So I had all the images first worked out, which wrote the pre-history. And then it's kind of Robert Frank onwards. And it was really interesting to put together. And the commissioning editor, a woman called Denise Wolfe, said to me, David, nobody gets to make a book about photographic road trips and it's not a bestseller. And I knew what she meant, that this couldn't be a book just for a kind of photo cognoscenti. It would need to have an audience beyond that. And the moment I realized that once the book was published that it did have an audience beyond that was I was asked to do one of the big bookshops in London asked me to do a signing in the run-up to Christmas. December 20th, 7 p.m. So I go along and I go up to the third floor, which is where the photography books are. And I said, I'm here to do my signing. And they said, there are no signings in the photography section. Your signing is in the travel section. And of course, first of all, I was a little bit offended. And
it would be too.
Well, we shouldn't be. The woman behind the camera, she could see I was a little bit offended. And she said, you know what? Do you want to know how many we've sold from the We do have it in the photography section. We've had it for 10 weeks. We've sold, I can't remember, like 6 copies. Do you know how many they've sold in the travel section? I said, no. She said, well, we've sold 73 copies. So where do you want to do your signing, Mr. Campany? Right? And the book is probably being bought by people who don't know who Justine Kurland or Inga Marat or Honorato and Krebs or William Eggleston or Stephen Shaw or Robert Frank even are, right? They're responding to something else. And this in a way is the limitation of photo world and photo book world.
Yeah.
I mean, I was helping a photographer called Anna Samoilova. I've helped her with 3 books, I think. And she's been very successful because she's a very good, photographic artist. But her books have subject matter that reach beyond that. Her first book was about what it's like to live in a flood zone, and the book was called Flood Zone. Then there was a book about Florida. And those books have audiences beyond photo world. Nothing wrong with that. Only appealing to photo world, but it's kind of limiting. You're never going to get beyond, a certain few thousand if you're lucky.
I really, really enjoy what you're saying there, and I try not to sound like a critic all the time. You know what I mean? But I often it felt like you go to Perry Photo, and it was photographers buying the photo books. It was just other photographers buying other photographers' work, And I felt like it was just kind of a closed ecosystem, And it felt like that. And I'm not saying that everyone is like that, you know what I mean, or that all of photography is like that. But it was, it seemed like it was the same people.
Yeah,
There's
a book I was asked to edit by a Polish photographer, Magdalena Wywrot, about her bringing up her daughter on her own as a kind of single mom for 7 or 8 years, the daughter between the ages of sort of 11 and 18. And that's had a great reception. Like photo book world really like it, but it's getting reviewed and talked about much more widely. And I think it's very beautiful and it's amazing work, but it has a kind of resonance because there's this very interesting, complicated relationship going on between the photographer mother and the daughter subject. And, sometimes they're collaborating and sometimes it's a very sentimental, affectionate relationship. Other times it's quite dark and uncertain. And I know it's finding an audience because so many mother-daughter photography projects are just kind of sentimental and rather cliched, and you've seen that kind of thing before. And I don't know if that's because those are just unoriginal people that are having unoriginal experiences of parenthood. I don't know. But this one's very, very different, and it's got a much, much wider audience. Did I edit it with that in mind? No. I had to edit it in a way that was true to the work, best I could. I love this picture here, early in the book, where the mother and the daughter almost become interchangeable. It's like those movies where characters kind of swap identities, kind of thing. Anyway, that's That's another example of the fact that the photographs can and should have multiple audiences. Otherwise it all gets a bit siloed and restrictive, I think.
Yeah, it's you actually bring up a very, very good point, and it's like it's almost like you have to understand where you sit in the world, not just you have to take a few steps back. And when you make that consideration, and you understand that, does that influence? Now, do you do any of the sequencing?
Oh yeah.
And do you play with that? And do you also, how important is writing? Talk to me about that part of it, the sequencing and the writing, and how you think about that.
I've not done many books where I was the sequencer and the writer. You have to be a bit careful that it becomes a bit totalizing. I don't like an editor credit on the front of the book because I think it's distracting. I'd rather my writing be at the back of the book and be an afterword than at the front of the book and be a forward. Even the placement of a text makes people think, oh, maybe I have to read this before I look at the pictures. Or even if I look at the pictures, it's with the knowledge that I should really be reading something first. I don't think you should really be reading something first. Do whatever you like. And even when I'm writing at the back of the book, I quite like to have my name at the end of the essay. I think it's just a bit distracting for people to have the editor credit there. I remember actually when Anna Samoylova did a roundup of 5 or 6 of her projects. And originally there was an editor credit on the cover, and I just thought, who needs to know that? That just doesn't have to happen.
It's nice, thank you, but it's like not necessary.
No.
I get it. Well, and that also comes from your philosophy, where the body of work, you're paying such respect to the body of work and the time spent on that and the ideas that are central to that. And so would you agree with that?
I do agree with that, but it's made me think that's gone to the core of it actually for me, because as much as I get to have a creative life doing all of these things, it is in the end service. I do feel like I'm helping, spotlighting, encouraging, giving a context or a space for people to enjoy or think about things. It's not totally selfless for me. I don't mean it like that. It's a very curious, service is a kind of, it's really interesting. It's
reciprocal.
Yeah,
for
it's
sure.
reciprocal. It's all.
Of course you get something out of it.
Of course I do get something out of it. And it's very, very rewarding in the way that, helping a student is really rewarding, or
Agreed.
Opening up a space for people to enjoy things or think about things in a different way, or a more enriching way, or a more critical way. So it's people think of creativity being attached to ego, and it's why society thinks, it's why society has turned the word creative into a noun, which I can't stand. Yeah, this person is creative, as if something about that person and their identity and their ego, and these people,
no, that's really funny.
These people are not creatives. These Right. It's like the term content provider, which everybody hates.
Yeah.
To be creative in the act of service to, larger ideas or work that you think is important or interesting. I'm very, very comfortable with that. And I keep getting messaged on Instagram by people saying, I don't know what you look like. Why are there no pictures of you on Instagram? Why are you, there's no selfies. There's no here I am at the opening of my exhibition, or I can't bear it. I'd much rather be behind things and presenting things. And there's lots of making and there's lots of creativity, but it does, it's not a spotlight business for me.
Yeah. No, I respect that a lot. I definitely respect that a lot. I like the removing the ego part. And what's interesting is I think when you are in service, you kind of have to, kind of switch that role, I guess. I couldn't help but as I was listening to you do this, I'm doing the exact same thing on this podcast. I'm getting to know artists and going through their bodies of work, but I'm also listening and seeing and stuff. In a lot of ways, I'm getting a lot out of it. It's deepening my own personal research, but it's also great for them. You know what I mean? So it's a kind of this great reciprocal nature to it, but I definitely feel like I'm of service. And it's something me and my mentor talk about a lot. And to hear you bring that up, it speaks to probably why I enjoy what you do so much. So I love what you do. I love the way you think. I love the way you write. I like the projects and stuff. I'm not trying to blow smoke right now. I'm just I'm a fan. And so I think we're almost done here. We're at our 2-hour limit. And so I only have one question that I ask everybody at the end. And I think that's a great place to kind of cap it off there. But it goes back to one thing. There's a lot of artists and photographers that follow this show, and I always like to give them a nugget of advice from the person that I'm talking to. So if there's anything you could tell makers and artists today, what would it be? Some people hate that question, and they like this other one instead. So I'll let you choose which one you want. There is, what would you tell your younger self? What kind of advice would you give your younger self?
Two different things, because the advice I would give is not to me, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But the advice I would give is protect your curiosity at all costs. It's a very fragile thing. When you're feeling like you're not making headway or you're down a kind of dead end, curiosity is the first thing to die. And you can get very existential very, very quickly. Curiosity needs feeding, like a pet, or but it needs protecting. It's not a robust thing. The reason I wouldn't give that advice to my younger self is because for some reason I realized that very, very, very early on. I have always fed my curiosity. I think it's to do with the fact that in my childhood I had large tracts of boredom, and the only way out of it is to connect yourself with things somehow.
Yeah, go down.
Yeah. So yeah. I don't need to give that as advice to myself, but I think that is quite a good advice to other people. I wish I'd been a bit more confident when I was younger, but I think the lack of confidence that I had when I was young was also its own advantage. I think I wasn't pushing myself to be in the world.
Yeah.
I was just concentrating on feeding that curiosity, so that when the chances came, I was reasonably good at what I was doing and reasonably hungry to do things. And there was a reservoir of fed curiosity that I already had, so that when the opportunities came along, but I think I could have tapped into that a bit younger if I'd been a bit more confident.
Talk about a presence. That's amazing. To realize that at a younger age. Yeah, that's amazing. But I love that. The curiosity to be protected.
Yeah.
That is, protect your curiosity. I think we should make shirts. That's a quote from David Campany on a shirt. Kind of like your gasoline shirt that you were selling there. I'm just kidding. I was like, hey, I might get that.
Sold out.
No, but what's that? Are they gone?
Yeah, they're gone. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Nah. Reserve that to the history. But no, I love that idea. And you're exactly right. When things become existential, when you get that is the first thing that goes.
I think so.
Mm-hmm. It definitely that, and the need to innovate, I think, is the maybe not. Maybe when you're innovating when you're existential, but I think that's fascinating. I love that, and I've never heard that before. This is one of my favorite parts about having you on the show. I'm hearing things for the first time. Go ahead.
I'm trying to be honest. Yeah,
I appreciate it.
Great.
But other than that, thank you so much for coming on the show. This is the spot where you can tell people how they can connect with you. I know you have an Instagram. That's how I reached out to you. You could share that handle in your website, and anything else you want to share there.
It's all on my website. I happen to have a name that there's only one other David Campany, as far as I know, and he's a doctor in Barcelona. He has the Twitter X, which I don't do, so I only do Instagram. And apart from that, I just have a website, and you can contact me through that. Yeah.
Awesome.
Great.
Well, it's from what I can tell, it was well designed by a former student, so I do remember that part. So, no, but thank you again. So, thank you for coming on. It was a wonderful conversation. I felt like we could have gone for another 2 hours, but I know you don't have time for that.
I have a book to finish.
Maybe next time. But thank you so much again, and hope to speak soon. So,
thank you. Great pleasure.
And to all those that have made it this far, thank you so much for joining us on the Urbanaut Podcast. If you like content like this, please like, share, and comment down below. That all helps us with this crazy thing called an algorithm. So if you would, please like, share, and comment. That all helps support this show. You can also support us through Patreon as well, and becoming a paid subscriber. That's another deeper form of support. And if you would like to do that. And as always, we'll see you next time.